Hello, I am Dr. Jim Prothero, and I'm working here today in conjunction with Northwind Seminary. And I'd like to give this talk that I intended to give at a previous conference, but it didn't quite happen. So Michael Christensen asked me to give it. You should have some materials with you that if you are taking this as a lesson, let me get this right here. You would have. One is Walker Gibson's Style Machine. That is a handout paper. And there is a second paper with three roughly 100-word prose samples from Lewis, Tolkien, and Barfield. Okay, so you'll need those two documents to do this. And you'll need to be able to do a little writing on your own. Okay, so have some paper ready. All right. I'm here today to talk about the concept of voice in writing, and specifically what I have discovered in the voice of C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and Owen Barfield in their writing. My material here, I will admit now, will overlap somewhat into what Terry Glaspie had to talk about at the conference that this was supposed to be at, and what Terry Glaspie has to say about tone and diction, but I still hope to give you all a fresh understanding and grasp of this vital tool in writing. I'm a college English professor, a part timer, which means most of my assignments are freshman composition, English 101, or something like that. And when I teach college freshman composition, beyond the usual things that students need to learn, I find that they have a terrible time grasping voice. One of the gravest dangers to an English professor reading a stack of papers is death by boredom. It's true. Sure, students have odd grammar constructs and writer's block, but the real issue is voice. The problem is dull, monotonous, expository writing that not only gets students graded down, it bores profs. One excellent teacher I know confessed to looking for distractions on a day that she'd set aside to grade papers, including cleaning toilets. She was desperate not to read student work. I'm convinced that most undergraduate writing students believe in the existence of a mythical sort of neutral writing voice, and I have that in quotes, and that somehow these students think that they are expected to assume it. Perhaps they believe this because once upon a time they ventured to have fun with their voice on paper and got their hands slapped with gallons of red ink. That was probably because they assumed a smart alecky adolescent voice that irritated their teacher, and he or she pounced on the student. But that would not have been a failure of voice, rather a failure to choose the right voice for the right audience. Some years back, Walker Gibson wrote a little book called Tough, Sweet, and Stuffy that I found very useful in the learning of style back in my undergraduate days. One must give credit where credit is due, and Gibson shaped my understanding of style. One of Gibson's first principles I still teach and always find that students at first refuse to believe me. It is simply this: whenever you write, you assume a voice. Whenever you write, you cannot help but to assume a voice. You assume a personality on page, and to a large degree, the writing succeeds or fails with the reader depending on whether or not the reader likes that person on the page. Every time you write, you engage in a personality contest of sorts. And you have to win, or the writing fails. I know this sounds ridiculous, but getting this idea across, I feel, is the most important bridge to cross in learning style. But it is true, and I can prove it from your own experience. Can you recall ever before putting something down that you were reading because, frankly, the writer irritated you, bored you silly, or even angered you, and not because you disagreed with them? Have you ever thought, I hope I never meet this scoundrel? Or conversely, thought you'd like to meet the author and talk with them, maybe have them over to dinner? I'm pretty sure you have had all of these experiences, and the decisive factor was voice. And as I tell my writing students, someone puts down your writing and stops reading or just zones out and retinizes, your communication has failed. By the way, retinizing is when your eyes pass over all of the words of an intended reading, but your mind is somewhere else, or maybe nowhere in particular. You come to the end having dutifully scanned every single word, and you realize that you have not the slightest idea of what you just read. I'm betting that you've had that experience too. So it is vital that we, in some form, have to like the writer. How many of us read the Narnia Tales first and thought to themselves, they really wish they could have met Mr. Lewis? That is a success of voice. How many of you have read Lord of the Rings and feel like you know Professor Tolkien somehow? That is a success of voice. This is a large part of the reason that student writing fails. Students are frightened, of putting real thought or anything out of themselves into a piece of writing for fear of getting slapped down. Consequently, they write in clipped, detached sentences that absolutely drip with boredom and disaffection. No wonder profs dread having to read a stack of papers. Students assume that neutral writing voice, which is in fact not neutral at all. It cries out, I'm bored and boring, knowing little or nothing. I didn't really embrace the assignment. Grade me down. Not exactly what the student had in mind, but that's how it comes across. And this is another principle that I teach my college writers. If you are bored when you write, your writing will be boring. If you are bored when you write, your writing will be boring. It is an absolute principle of voice. Likewise, if you are intrigued or thrilled when you write, that comes out in your writing voice. One of the things I liked about Diana Gleyer's, the company they keep, and I liked a lot of things, is that though it is a responsible, thorough, and scholarly study, the voice is full of childlike wonder. She's having an adventure. It invites the reader to explore this magical country called the Inklings, and it is difficult not to catch the writer's enthusiasm. That is a success of voice. Likewise, as I am sure many, if not all of you have noticed, that Tolkien's voice in The Hobbit is entirely different in the beginning of the book from the way it is at the end. In the beginning, we have an intrusive narrator telling the young audience all the magical and curious things about hobbits and Middle-earth. The voice is grandfatherly, enjoying the telling as much as the children enjoyed listening to him, and focused on the reader's understanding with parental empathy. By the end of the book, the voice is almost a chant of an Anglo-Saxon battle tale, and we are entering the narrative world of the Fellowship of the Ring. The narrator is far away from us, looking off into the distance and entranced by ancient lore. As meticulous as Tolkien is, I've always wondered why he did not go back and alter the opening voice, or go to the end and change the voice back, instead of having a transition from one voice to another. Lewis was careless about such things to a certain degree. One can argue that much of Lewis's writing is essentially first draft, though we have evidence that he made emendations so that we might call it a second draft. But after that, off to the publishers, proof the proofs, and forget about it. Next book. I've always had the impression that what we read in Tolkien is about 46th draft. So why did Tullers leave this radical change in voice in The Hobbit unaltered? Maybe Gandalf knows, but I do not. But I think we need here to define voice, and that is a difficult task. I would say it is personality on paper. Voice is personality on paper. That, however, is too vague. What I tell my writing students is to imagine that you have written two notes, one to your mother and the other to your significant other. Now, imagine that you mixed up the two notes and both notes went to the wrong recipient. At this point in my class, eyebrows usually shoot up and a look of horror crosses my students' face. I tell them that they have just proved that they understand voice. Even if the contents of the note was similar, you never talk to your mother in the same voice you talk to your lover. In fact, you never talk to your mother in the same voice as you talk to your father, or as the same voice you use when your mother and father are together. Those are all separate voices. So, how do we achieve voice? Well, by diction, that is word choice, and using combined metaphor and connotation, irony, human, and even a little pathos. That's roughly half of it, maybe. Several of those things combine to create tone. The combination of fresh metaphor combined with the connotation is one of the most powerful things you can do in writing. It is your biggest gun. Metaphor is more convincing than logic, something that C.S. Lewis understood very well. And if you've read Mere Christianity, you know that's true. One can almost argue that Mere Christianity is a short story collection more than a nonfiction because of CSL's constant use of fresh metaphor, i.e., the tin soldier who's becoming a real person. Tin has connotations of stiffness and subhuman qualities, which reinforces the original metaphor. Irony and humor, as I mentioned, are also part of it. Of course, if you think about it, all humor depends on a sense of irony, of expecting one thing and being surprised by something else. That is why old jokes aren't funny if the hero already knows the punchline. Why did the chicken cross the road? Was a scream the first time someone told it. Without the surprise, or perhaps the bitter burn of irony, there is no humor. C.S. Lewis is a master, as we see, for instance, in the opening of Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where his sentence reads, "There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it." Pathos, or empathy, is also part of voice, and is often achieved by what the writer's voice shows us. Someone once said of movies in reference to the audience, if you can make them laugh and make them cry, you've got a winner. The principle is true of all writing, though I'd add other opposites, such as if you can make them think and make them feel, or if you can awaken longing and stir angry rejection in the same story, you got them. But those items, though vital, are often what are most noticed. They're frosting. The real rock bottom layer of voice is diction, that is, word choice. As I said about 6.5 billion years ago, when I was an undergraduate at Northern Arizona University, I took a rhetoric class from the excellent professor, Dr. Sharon Crowley. She required us to work through a book by one Walker Gibson titled Tough, Sweet, and Stuffy. Gibson's thesis is that all voice is the various possible mixes of three essential voices, which he calls tough, sweet, and stuffy. All these billions of years later, I'm not sure I agree with his concept that there are only three principal voices with mixed variation. It seems to me that the possibilities for voice are almost infinite, and not limited mixtures of three principal ones. But I'd like to lay out his concepts before you as a way of taking a detailed look at how much and to what degree diction creates voice. So, Gibson divides the types of possible voices into three main types: tough, sweet, and stuffy. Each voice is accomplished by a certain use of grammar and sentence construction. This is all technical. You can do this yourself. This is not instinct. The tough voice is the voice of writers like Hemingway. It makes me think of the voice of Humphrey Bogart in noir films where he plays a jaded detective. It is short and clipped, terse, and no nonsense. It is made by using short, clipped words, that's the first criterion, and short, clipped sentences. Adjectives are few and concrete. And if you're not sure what a concrete adjective is, it's something that you can sense with one of your five senses: green, soft, cold, as opposed to beautiful and lovely, which are abstract adjectives. It is often in the first person or vaguely third person. We learn this voice when we are kids and our parents yell at us. You notice when your parents yell it's always short clipped, and you know you're really in trouble if they use your entire name. Anyway, in literature or film, it's the voice we associate with cynical libertines or disillusioned war veterans. Here's a sample. I walked down the road. She was gone. Nothing for it. Turn away. The trees shook in the wind, cold, hard drops falling on my face. Their green leaves were gray, dull and dirty gray, like an asphalt highway. Every growing thing was metal. My heart was metal. Hell with it. Forget her. Okay, that's the sample. I'm trying to imitate Hemingway there. The effect of the clipped, tough voice slaps the reader awake and demands attention, and with no nonsense. It can be faintly, if not overtly, hostile. It grabs the reader by the collar and shakes them. Okay, and I want to take a side trip at this point and point out another principle of rhetoric that is a vital element of voice, and that is short words and short sentences have the effect of slapping us awake. Recall that when you were in trouble as a child, short clip sentences and words were launched at you like ICBMs. How I remember the staccato, "James Wayne Prothero, you come here right now." Oh, that's when I knew I was in trouble. The converse is also true. Long words and long sentences have a soporific effect. They soothe us and put you to sleep. All good writing is a balance between these two extreme principles, and that balance I call sentence rhythm. That is the sound pattern that writer creates in the way they vary the use of long and short sentences and long and short words. And it's always something that you do individually, and it's as unique to you the way you do it as your thumbprint. Okay, so back to the main point. The sweet voice is the voice we associate with advertising. It is gentle and friendly voice of persuasion. It is marked by, and here's the technical parts, more frequent use of sometimes multisyllabic and always vague adjectives, always abstract adjectives, and the constant use of the second person, you. Okay, we don't use it that much. I, me, that's the first person. You, he, they, us, she, that's the third person. And we usually use one of those two. We don't think you do this, you do that, and then you think this. That's a second person. We don't use it that much, but it's part of the sweet voice. And here's my sample. This is just an ad I've taken from a billion ads I've heard. Walking on the beach on the French Riviera, dancing in silk dress and tux at the Ritz. That's the life for you. No compromises on the beautiful life. It's all beautiful for you. And that's why you really want to own an incredible Spexus sedan, luxury and class, your style. Let others stand and watch. Go see your Spexus dealer today. Okay, so we've all heard stuff like that a million times, advertising. This kind of prose crawls up in our lap and tries to seduce us. And it can also be political, like, for instance, here's another sample. John Candidate is the man you want in Washington now. When difficult decisions have to be made, you can count on John Candidate to make the right decisions in the right time, not to cave into the voice of extremism, and to stand up for unpopular causes that he knows are right. Vote for John Candidate. And notice in that lovely little paragraph, you have no idea what he stands for. The sweet voice is there to sell us, even as what it sells us is contradictions. And last, the third voice. The stuffy voice is the voice of much of academic or business prose, and I should add, sadly, government prose, that we find so hard to read. It is marked by the passive voice, long multisyllabic words, and the use of impersonal subjects for sentences. The passive voice is a strange thing we do in English, where we eliminate subject and add distance. You simply put the verb behind the to be verb and use the object like a subject instead of. So we have, as an example, instead of saying John hit the ball, we say the ball was hit. We could add by John, but the perverse beauty of the passive voice is that you don't have to. This feature alone makes it popular with politicians. Instead of saying I voted for the tax raise, a politician can say the tax hike was voted for. Pretty slick. Responsibility goes right out the window. You are sure to recognize the stuffy voice. Now, I have a sample here, and I dare any of you to understand what it is I'm saying in this short paragraph. Here it goes. The decentralization of educational institutions in reference to class size reduction is a primary goal of Better Schools Initiative. Return to significantly graduated scores has been cited as another primary objective, along with improvement in management objective strategies. It is hoped that improvement will be seen in the foreseeable future. Have you any idea what I just said? I'm sure you don't. And that's gobbledygook. And for the record, it actually says schools are trying to improve. You know what, 6 words? Okay, anyone who has been in the worlds of law, medicine, education, business will recognize this sort of obtuse prose. It should be a misdemeanor to write it, if not an outright felony. But it comes out in government and corporate reports and specialized textbooks that students are forced to buy for way too much money. Why would anyone choose to write like this? It's a really good question, but the answer, once again, lies in voice. The voice here is defensive. It is out to depersonalize itself and bury the reader in detail and vocabulary so that the writer is not vulnerable. This may be because the writer is a corporate drone in fear of losing their job, or an academic trying to sound knowledgeable to get tenure. Both writers use unnecessarily large words and abstract subjects to sound impressive, to sound smart. Sadly, if this is academic prose, they write not for the poor students who have to buy their textbooks, but to impress their colleagues that sit on tenure committees and decide if the writer is going to keep their job or get a raise. Stuffy writing is a way of walling up against the reader and putting on a disguise of high vocabulary knowledge in order to defend yourself against repercussions. It is a futile attempt to avoid having a voice in writing at all. to wear a mask of super intelligent invulnerability. Unfortunately, it does not have that effect on the reader. It is just muddy and hard to understand. So beyond this, I tell my college students that long sentences are mental speed bumps. Even if you're not reading aloud, every time you hit a long word, you mentally slow down. And if the writer stacks 4 or 5 long words in a row, it's like hitting a speed bump every 2 feet. I tell my students to write Saxon. All the short words, by the way, are Saxon in origin. Your writing will be far clearer if you stay away from long words unless they are necessary. But those are the general principles. Now, you're going to use Gibson's analysis on your own prose. Bear in mind, once again, that I do not share Gibson's belief that all voice is a variation and mixture of the 3 principles, but I still think you as writers might gain some insight into the mechanics of your own prose by running it through some of Gibson's style machine. As you can see, the machine itself is pretty complex and probably overly time-consuming for our purposes here at Northwind. So rather than do it all, I propose that we just use 8 categories. Do numbers 1 through 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, number 11, number 12, and number 15. I'll say that again. Numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, 11, 12, and lastly, number 15, which will together illustrate what I most consider the vital elements of voice and style at the grammar level. If you wish to run your prose through the entire machine at your own leisure later, that is your option. For now, take 100 words for your own prose, and this is something you are also asked to do, to have some of your 100 words of your own prose and run them through just those selected categories on the style machines using only the numbers I've selected. Now I'm going to give you work time, so you can pause this here. Okay, you've turned us on again after the pause. Now that you've had the chance to run your prose through Gibson's style machine, let's look at how the Inklings did. And I have 3 readings here, one from Mere Christianity. You should have copies of this, so I will not read them out to you. There's 112 words from Mere Christianity. There are 101 words from Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. And there are 100 words from Barfield's Poetic Diction. Now, look at your own scores. And the way you're going to add this up is how many things, you use the style machine, and if what you find in your prose fits one of those things, you put it down for tough, sweet, or stuffy. So you're going to have certain ones that are tough, certain ones that are stuffy, and certain ones that are sweet. Okay? And you're going to add those up. So you'll have 3, right? Now, I have done this with the Inklings, and you might be interested what the scores are. So CSL, that is C.S. Lewis's passage from Mere Christianity, scores 6 tough, 4 sweet, and 0 stuffy. Well, what does that tell us? Well, he's very high on tough and very rock bottom on stuffy. He uses shorter words. He writes understandably. The 4 sweet tells us that he really tries to reach the reader, that he's really doing things that makes the reader feel at home, that makes the reader feel like he's sitting down with Jack Lewis. Okay, Tolkien's passage from On Fairy Stories scores, surprise, 7 tough, 1 sweet, and 1 stuffy. You might think of Tolkien as a little stuffier than Lewis, but he's not. He gets straight to the point when he's writing expository prose. Okay? And lastly, Owen Barfield's passage from Poetic Diction. This might also surprise you. It's 3 tough, 1 sweet, and 3 stuffy. So it's a balance between more academic, wordy, long word prose that we would call stuffy, and more direct, to the point, short words, Saxon tough. Okay, and if you've ever read Barfield, he is much more academic and harder to read than Lewis. So this shouldn't surprise us. Okay, so let me explain, now that you have finished, why I believe these 9 elements, was it 8 or 9? I think it was 8. I think that's a typo. All right, I consider them vital. Numbers 1 through 3, they asked you to put through the style machine. The 1 through 3 in the style machine. The importance of writing Saxon, that is, writing the short words, which we get from the Saxon, especially C.S. Lewis, achieves clarity. C.S. Lewis, and I would say also in America, E.B. White, are sort of the school of clear prose, and they are big believers that it's the writer's job to reach out and make sure the reader understands. And when I teach writing, this is what I teach because I'm of the same school of thought. There's another school of thought that comes out of modernism after 1918, which would include James Joyce in Britain and William Faulkner here in America, what I call the molasses school. And they feel that the writer is an inspired genius and they're going to put down whatever their muse tells them to write, and it's your job as the reader to swim through the molasses of this prose and figure out what it all means. No, I don't like that. Lewis and E.B. White, yeah, those are the guys I agree with. Okay. Number 4 has to do with the subjects of sentences. Here's another weird thing about rhetoric, and I didn't invent this idea, but if the subject of your sentence is human or close to human, the sentence will be far clearer. I don't know why this is true. It's just a weird psychological thing. Okay. Number 5 was about passive voice. And I would say to all writers, avoid the passive voice. The only time you ever need it is when you don't know who did something. You know, the gun was fired. Who by who? Well, we don't know. Okay. Then you need passive voice. Otherwise, it just muddies writing. Stay away from it if you possibly can. Okay, 11 and 12. Join me in Monster Claws Anonymous, Writers Anonymous. And I tend to do this when I have to go back through and edit my stuff. I write complex sentences and I put too many clauses on them and it gets a little tortured. And I go, okay, let's break that into 2 or 3 sentences. So, stay a little shorter. When students ask me, once they understand how to do a complex sentence, and they'll ask me, how long can I go? I say, well, technically you can go as long as you want. Steinbeck, in the beginning of East of Eden, wrote a sentence that went a paragraph and a half. But I don't recommend that because basically reality is if at the end of your sentence, your reader is trying to remember what the beginning of the sentence was about, you're introducing confusion and lack of clarity. So that's a bad thing. Okay, so chop up those clauses. Anyway, last thing I want to say is agree with C.S. Lewis. Clarity is job 1 in writing. Clarity is job 1. Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed this and learned something else. Learn something about your prose that you weren't aware of when you started. Anyway, thank you and enjoy your classes at Northwind Seminary. It's a noble endeavor.